with a reactor system giving out a combined 1.83 gigawatts.
Today we're going to be looking at a heavily requested channel called Found and Explained, specifically the nuclear-powered flying aircraft carrier, the never-built CL-1201. I can't imagine why they would never build something like this. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler Folse. I'm a nuclear engineer with a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry, from engineering operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge. Let's check out this behemoth. The two of them?
In 1969, Lockheed was tasked by the US Air Force to design a plane that was so big that it could carry 3,000 troops, launch 22 Parasite air-to-air jet fighters, and fly for 41 days straight without landing.
Okay. So, before we even get into the nuclear power aspect, this thing is ginormous. What would you even make this thing out of? To get something like that to fly, to get the aerodynamics as well as the weight distribution, putting all your engines, all your sources of thrust in like that, but you're going to have such a long wingspan. Okay, yeah, there's some... If you were to even just draw like a free body balance of force diagram on something like this, would you even get that? Does it have like smaller like thrusters on the side? Are we designing, is the US just making some sort of Imperial Star Destroyer here? Because that's kind of what that thing does in Star Wars, except it goes into space. But wow.
But this design would never see the light of day, facing design challenges such as building a powerful enough nuclear reactor to how to even take off into the sky.
Yeah, getting off the ground. Putting a nuclear power plant, sure. I mean, a nuclear power plant could provide you enough energy, but also, I mean, they work on seaborne aircraft carriers as opposed to airborne ones just fine. They work on submarines. There's even certain types of battle cruisers that use nuclear power plants, but there's never been, whether it be military or commercial, a flying nuclear power plant. There's been many designs, but here we're like, just getting the size right and getting this thing to fly would be your first real challenge. And then we'll go ahead and address, how do we put a nuclear power plant in here? How do we make this thing safe? Because one of the advantages of, say, a submarine, if it sinks to the bottom of the sea and they have a nuclear accident, well, you're essentially fine, because how you respond to nuclear accidents, for the most part, is going to involving dumping a bunch of water on it so the fuel doesn't melt. And you're at the bottom of an ocean with a nigh infinite heat sink, then maybe. So what would even be your safety protocol? Make sure this thing, all bits and pieces of this, if this gets destroyed, that it lands in the ocean? Because this is a military aircraft, as in, people are going to try to shoot this thing down.
Designed by Lockheed to find the upper size limit of an aircraft using conventional 1969 materials and technology, this is the CL-1201, the biggest aircraft never built. The world of the late 60s was certainly an interesting one, right in the middle of the Cold War and with an America that faced enemies across the globe. The Department of Defense believed that there was a small chance that the USA would become isolated from its allies and
this great red scare fear. Oh, look, all of the allies turning red, going communist. Yeah, it was very much a different time.
cut off from its overseas bases. Thus, the leaders that be needed a solution that could project an entire US Army brigade slice abroad, especially to landlocked areas of the globe that were out of reach from the US's many carrier groups.
Highly mobile joint task forces comprised of Army and Air Force units to move rapidly to objective areas and accomplish the mission.
The solution would be an aircraft, While the Boeing 747 had just taken flight was considered for the Air Force as a flying aircraft platform, Lockheed was put onto track to develop something even more gargantuan.
Because they didn't think that thing was big enough. That's amazing.
A giant, city-sized, flying aircraft carrier. The top secret project would be dubbed the CL-1201, based on the aerodynamic research of a previous project called the CL-1170,
Wow.
but with an extensively increased dimension.
So it doesn't take a nuclear engineer to know how silly this design is, or an aeronautical engineer for that matter, but I do admire some things from back then that it's like, let's just come up with this crazy thing, and even just looking in just the ambition of doing something this crazy. Like, I've never heard of anything like, let's just, I don't know, even something as simple of, let's just build another 300 nuclear power plants to solidify a long-term safe energy source. And that's kind of where things were back in the 1960s. Now, granted, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, this was long before those things ever occurred. There was so much in this big aerospace, in nuclear power, back then. There's even one accident in the US that a lot of people don't know about. A lot of people know about 3 Mile Island, and that was, they had fuel damage, but there wasn't any radiological release, and yet a lot of people seem to act like there were. But there was an accident in Fermi Unit 1, and there's even a book written about it called The Day We Almost Lost Detroit. And this was due to a foreign material exclusion issue, or FME issue. A metal object broke loose within its reactor vessel and blocked off the reactor coolant. This was a liquid sodium-cooled reactor, and coolant didn't reach the reactor. Fuel ended up overheating. 1% of the fuel melted down. This happened in 1966, its first year of operation. Yet no one ever seems to remember that one. Now, granted, it was longer, but back then there was just a different attitude towards nuclear power. And by the way, that's why nuclear power plants have what's known as the FME program, which is a program designed to put additional protective measures in place to ensure foreign material exclusions never happen again, either in the reactor vessel, the main turbine, reactor coolant pumps. Basically, when any piece of equipment is opened up for maintenance, you have to ensure everything is protected against any objects that shouldn't be there. FME is something take very seriously in the nuclear industry.
The airframe would measure a wingspan of 1,120 feet and be 560 feet long, giving the
So comparable to an aircraft carrier wingspan. And that wingspan is much longer than its length. Wow. I'm not an aerospace engineer, but I'm used to seeing like 1.5 to 1 rather than 2 to 1. But I guess as things get that much more massive, you're going to need that much more lift, and even then, I'm not sure this sucker's going to fly.
Fuselage and interior space of 2 million cubic feet. A plane whose wingspan was 45 feet wider than the Chrysler Building in New York is tall. As for how much this plane could carry, the figure was set around 10 million to 12 million pounds, or 5.4 thousand tons, a figure that was ballparked only by the engineers because Lockheed couldn't figure out why anyone would need to carry any more weight than that.
Kind of goes back to the very beginning of the problem statement here, is how big of an aircraft do you really need to accomplish this crazy objective? Or you could just have a wing of smaller craft.
For such a huge plane, conventional fuel wouldn't cut it. This sucker would be nuclear powered, with a reactor system giving out a combined 1.83 gigawatts.
Really? He had to pronounce it gigawatts. 1.83. Wow. So I'm assuming he's talking thermal, not electrical. So that's about half of a commercial nuclear power plant. And those nuclear power plants do not move. They just power cities. And that would also make this reactor 3 times more powerful than that of an aircraft carrier, the regular type of aircraft carrier ship, not a flying aircraft carrier.
Allowing this plane to fly for 41 days straight at Mach 0.8 over 16,000 feet.
So 41 days straight. So, man, that would be a pain if they had to refuel the reactor that much. Do they not carry that much fuel? Now, or maybe he's talking about other aspects of maintenance you need to do on the plane rather than refueling it. I mean, after all, if it's going to be carrying that, however many people are supposed to be in this, I don't know how much food it's carrying, how much fuel it's carrying for the other type of aircraft it's going to carry on this aircraft carrier. Because a sea-based aircraft carrier can go 20 years without refueling. But it's not having to generate nearly as much thrust because it can just go in the water. I'm not sure how fast this thing's supposed to be.
Only having to land because the crew would run out of food and
Okay, thank you for answering my question.
water. A crew complement that on the bottom side of the scale would number 475, but may go up to 800 during an active combat zone.
Wow, that's a lot. Now, you're going to need some specialists on this aircraft. So, I mean, pilots go through their own sort of training program, but you're also going to need to train some reactor operators, which is a whole other type of certification program. Now, in the commercial nuclear industry, training a reactor operator can take 12 to 18 months, and a senior reactor operator, basically their direct manager, takes 18 to 24 months. I got my senior reactor operator license in 24 months, but I went directly there from the engineering division. I didn't have plant operator or reactor operator experience, which is why it took a little bit longer for me than someone who went up through the ranks of operations. And Naval Nuclear Power School, I didn't go to that, but based on conversations I've had with a lot of my coworkers who went through that, it can still take a while. I'm getting qualified on certain watches. It doesn't take 24 months, but it still takes quite a bit of specialized training to get people up to speed. But 475 to 800, I mean, that's a lot. I mean, I guess it's comparable to an aircraft carrier in that I guess you got a flying city instead of a floating city.
All needed to keep this plane flying and in operations 24/7. The reactor itself wouldn't need to be...
You're also going to need, you're going to need separate shifts if this thing's going to be around. Separate crew complements, like there's going to be people on there that are going to be off duty because if this thing's flying for 41 days straight, you're going to have multiple crews rotating through, manning the watch 24/7. Well, at least that's the way in commercials. From what I've heard stories about in the navies, you never really get any days off. Someone correct me if I'm wrong about that. I mean, that could have just been some recreational complaining, but I wouldn't put it past them.
refueled for over 1,000 operation hours.
1,000 operation hours, but this thing's going to be effectively run 24/7. Now that may be in effective full power hours. That's one way of measuring fuel consumption in a nuclear power plant. So one thing I'm not sure about is, would this thing need to be running at full power all the time? That's not necessarily the case on naval reactors. It might need to run close to full power when it's taking off, when it's accelerating, but it could be longer than 1,000 actual hours because it might not need to be at 100% power when it's sitting at cruising altitude. But I don't really have much of an analog to this because there haven't been any flying nuclear power plants operational, so who knows?
Because of this, the plane wouldn't have any range limitations. It could fly anywhere in the world. Well, apart from where it could possibly land. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. You see, there are
how big's the runway?
two versions of this plane. The CL1201-1-1 and the CL1201-1-3. There was also technically a Mystery -2 version, but all information about that has been scrubbed.
Redacted, of
But
course.
bear with me and we'll get back to that model later. The first version, the CL1201-1, was dubbed the Attack Aircraft Carrier. It would carry 11 fighter bombers under each wing and 2 more in the fuselage hangars.
So how are you getting into there? Are there hatches above each wing? Man, I can imagine that being nerve-wracking. Just open the door, this massive gust of air out, and you're trying to get on this. And when docking, good luck. So never flown a plane, but when docking this thing, this aircraft is going to have such a massive jet wash and all the turbulent air coming out of the back of its engines. I mean, I know aircraft do approach closely for mid-air refuelings, but this thing is just so big.
For a total of 24 aircraft on board. While we don't know what these final mini-jets would have been like, in the documents that we have perused, they are listed as the F-4 Phantom. The idea was that this plane would serve as the spear.
I guess that might make sense for the time period. This was back in the 60s.
At the start of an invasion or military power projection, and would be the command center for any military operation. The plane will also carry 10 long-range attack missiles,
Of course.
with Lockheed not ruling out that their warheads would be nuclear-tipped. This plane would never land in enemy territory, simply circling the battlefield at 30,000 feet and around 600 miles away. As for going deep behind enemy lines, that was up to the CL-1201-3, or dubbed the Logistical Support Aircraft, or LSA. The LSA would be the carrier for the bulk of the mission, bringing drop troops and other equipment to the theatre of war. It would carry 400 ground troops and 1,150 tons of cargo. But you might be wondering, how did the LSA deploy these troops?
I love this animation and stuff. I mean, this really does seem like one of the planes from Ace Combat. Didn't specify if it was nuclear powered or not. It probably used magic like most things are in that game. The same magic, while an F-16 can hold 200 missiles or whatever the capacity was in that game. It's crazy.
Well, that's the job of the equally ridiculous medium intra-theatre transport plane.
That's a mouthful.
Converted Boeing 707s that would fly troops and materials back and forth from the LSA and to the battlefield.
Are those things expected to land on that or dock somehow with this CL-1201? This thing might be big enough to not just be an airborne aircraft carrier, but also an airborne aircraft carrier. Wow.
The LSA would have a fleet of 5 707 MITs that would physically dock 3 at a time to the LSA. How
tiny those are.
Whilst in flight.
And those are big, wide-bodied transport aircraft. And they're tiny.
The planes would approach from the rear and connect to the back of the plane, powering down their engines and opening up their nose through a special pressurized airlock. These planes would then fly troops and gear to the drop zones for either paratrooper operations or landing at friendly or captured airports. In addition to the 400 troops and equipment on board the LSA,
so I guess, yeah, so your 707s, I mean, even those require a decent-sized runway compared to, say, a fighter plane. But this thing, what kind of runway we needed to have this thing take off? You need, like, I don't know, 30 kilometers of runway or something?
There would also be 150 troops on each MIT, to a combined force of 1,150 troops in the entire mini fleet. But these aircraft wouldn't actually operate on their own. You see, it would be a fleet group of a single attack aircraft carrier.
Of course, yeah, why have just one of these? Let's have a whole wing of these big behemoths that cost $1 trillion apiece or whatever. Maybe not $1 trillion back in 1960s dollars, but still.
And 7, yes, that's right, 7 logistical support aircraft. Because the fleet would be flying for 41 days straight, each plane had 6 decks for crew sleeping, recreation, mess halls, strategic command, and much more.
So they have to walk basically through the loading ramp back by the reactor to go to the mess hall to get their little lunch break, the guys that are working in the bulk area. Okay.
Including the vast cargo bay, which was 22 times bigger than the Antonov 225. During deployment and flight,
and those Antonovs are big planes too. That's wow.
Operations to move equipment around would need to be coordinated to prevent the center of gravity shifting too much. In total, the combined fleet would carry 3,896 ground troops, 6,207 tons of equipment, 30 days of food and water, artillery, light aircraft, and even attack helicopters.
Yes, attack helicopters in your aircraft. And artillery in there. They could just, I don't know, they could just turn the plane runs out of ammo, and shoot the artillery from the plane. It'd be like a much bigger AC-130 or something.
Enough for a complete invasion of almost any country in the world.
Is it though? Can you really invade like a large country with, I mean, I guess you could maybe attack certain areas. It'd be a big enough strike force, but maybe he means in terms of being able to reach any country in the world and do some initial attack. But I don't know but this force can't invade and like take over China, for instance. It's just not enough people.
While such an awesome projection of power would be invaluable for the surrounded United States, there were several major flaws with the design.
Oh yes.
First of all, we have to address the elephant in the room. How on earth would this gigantic aircraft even take to the skies? After all, with a wingspan so wide and 8 feet wide wheels approximately 200 meters along the wing, the runway itself would need to be easily 650 feet across, let alone kilometers long to even let this plane get up to speed.
Yeah, you're gonna need several kilometers. There are certain passenger planes like the Airbus A380 that can't exactly land whenever it wants to, which is a little scary. When it encounters an emergency, it might be limited as to what airport it can even land at.
No such runway exists, and several would need to be built for the extra capability for worldwide operations.
Absolutely.
But designers thought of this and came up with, honestly, a pretty ingenious solution. For you see, the aircraft wouldn't take off from a runway.
They're gonna make this VTOL? What? Rockets?
All. It would fly vertically like a Harrier jet. The LSA would use 54 of the recently developed turbojet engines that have been used on the Boeing 747.
So that's where all those extra megawatts are coming from for its takeoff. Okay.
To provide over 82,000 pounds of thrust. The aircraft attack version would need a staggering 182 turbojets to provide the same vertical lift. Each engine would be in clusters of 20.
And what about those big guys? Now, I guess those are just your cruising engines, and not to mention, those things are massive. You could probably fly a 737 into one of those.
Throughout the plane and would run off conventional jet fuel. But you might be asking why. If this plane was designed to fly from
So they're not using the nuclear reactor for that.
the continental United States to take on enemies abroad and never land, then why give it the ability to land vertically at all? Above 16,000 feet, the 4 massive turbojet engines, each with a diameter of a Boeing 747, would power up with the tips going supersonic. If they rotated at 2,000 rotations per minute, the tips would be moving at over 4,000 feet per second, the definition of hypersonic. Such engine technology is almost beyond today's level of technology and would have been an impressive feat for designers back in 1969.
You run into that sort of thing with the whole difference between tip velocity and edge velocity. There are certain wind turbines, the massive ones, that don't even look like they're spinning that fast, but the tips are going close to supersonic. So you just have to be careful and think of the long-term system health. You really want it to be causing those sort of shock waves.
Power all of these engines, the CL-1201 would have a nuclear fission reactor that would provide 1.83 gigawatts for all operations.
Now I'm wondering if he actually thinks it's pronounced gigawatts, but I guess he's still making the Back to the Future joke. It's funny. This is about as practical as the time machine from Back to the Future.
On board. Although the plane would also have a small fuel compartment as a backup and to assure that the VTOL capacity worked when needed. To keep the crew safe from radiation during the flight from the reactor, the 30-foot wide reactor core would have a 20-foot wall of radiation protection, adding to the enormous weight of the aircraft.
That's big. I mean, it's effectively, yeah, it's comparable to some commercial nuclear power plants. Smaller than the one that I worked at. It's about half the size in terms of megawatts, but this makes naval nuclear reactors look tiny. And yes, you're going to have a reactor containment building like what he's saying, in order not just to protect from the neutron field that exists when the reactor is operating, but also in case of any mishaps, explosions, either it be if they're from a postulated nuclear accident, or if it's just from damage to the plane, because this is a military aircraft. The enemy is going to want to shoot this thing down, so the nuclear power plant is going to want to be well protected. It's probably going to be the most well protected part of the aircraft, though I can only imagine the radiological release problem. If one of these things gets shot down, it's falling, it just breaks up. And if enough damage is done to the reactor portion of this by anti-aircraft artillery or missiles or whatever weapons you're using to bring this thing down, it could release some nasty radioactive fission products across whatever landscape it's flying over. I mean, I guess that's one way of penalizing whoever shot this thing down. This is one design thing that is less of a concern with nuclear power in submarines and aircraft carriers, because they'll just go to the bottom of the ocean. This thing could crash right on top of a populated area.
And to keep the reactor cool, liquid metal would transport the heat to the exterior of the plane, touching the supercool air outside.
Okay, so it's going to be using liquids, probably liquid sodium. I can see them going with this. I mean, the technology did exist in the 1960s for this. It's probably one of the less dense, less amount of material that you would use compared to, say, a pressurized water reactor, for instance. And here, you're so much more concerned about weight since you're trying to get this thing to fly. It's more efficient, much higher thermal conductivity, so you don't need as much of it to give you the same amount of heat transfer. Problems are, it has a lot more complex maintenance required, and you're flying, so you're not exactly in an area where you can afford that as much. So if there's any issues with liquid sodium, you're going to have to land. Also, if these were built at scale on the ground for commercial nuclear power plants, a lot of them were right next to essentially a chemical plant where you make liquid sodium. Really wouldn't recommend doing this in an aircraft, because that's just going to add another facility for you. But theoretically, if you have enough of it and nothing goes wrong, sure, it's going to have some edges over pressurized water reactors, but it's just an additional layer of complexity on something you're trying to make into a plane that is just going to add more and more design challenges.
To prevent radioactive material spilling out during a crash, the reactor was designed to shut down within 20 seconds and could survive a head-on impact with a mountain.
Head-off with a mountain, sure. I mean, that's great for designing your containment structure. 20 seconds? That's bad. That's like Chernobyl bad in terms of shutdown time. For commercial nuclear power plants, you're looking at about 2 seconds in terms of how fast those control rods can shut down the plant. I mean, ultimately, what caused Chernobyl to the ultimate final nail in the Chernobyl coffin was a failed emergency shutdown. And while that had other reasons it failed, such as the graphite-tipped control rods, which is the reactivity equivalent of when you need to slam on the brakes, you actually hit the accelerator a bit before you slam on the brakes. But a lot of it, but it was also the slow response time. When you need to do an emergency shutdown, it needs to be immediate. Like if this plane were to get shot down, you're going to want everything to be immediate, or as immediate as you can. So 2 seconds over 20 seconds.
Traveling at 600 miles per hour without breaking apart. Speaking of impact, the designers also realized that it would be susceptible to missile attacks.
Yep.
The solution was laser cannons and laser point defense systems.
The way he said laser cannons, I just think of Star Wars.
To blow any missiles out of the sky before
No CWIS like you see on an aircraft carrier? Okay.
they reach this giant plane. But as we don't have many lasers in use today, you can see how this idea would have gone. In the end, the CL-1201...
I mean, theoretically, airborne lasers could help, but it's just more added bulk. Of all the silly technology he's describing here, airborne lasers are probably among the more reasonable compared to the hypersonic engines, the trying to put a liquid metal reactor on an aircraft. Make it slightly more plausible. Still not going to see it.
Project didn't get any further thanks to the enormous cost, and what could have been has now faded into history. But maybe, and this is the crazy part, maybe it actually was built. That's right, it's time to pull out the tinfoil and believe in something so crazy
Conspiracy theorists?
that maybe there's a nugget of truth. In March of 1997, there was a series of...
You're gonna say UFOs were that? It's a secret thing? Wow.
widely cited UFO objects across Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico dubbed the Phoenix Lights. Witnesses described the object as a giant flying V that was bigger than a 747 and sounded like the gushing wind. Despite being nighttime, witnesses saw several lights like those found on aircraft blinking in the darkness, and the object was so huge.
Well, you know what they're going to say? They're going to say it was a weather balloon.
That it visibly hid the stars in the sky. UFO experts suggested that this object would have been at least...
UFO experts. I'm sure he's saying this in jest, but I like the idea of being an expert on something where the first letter of the acronym is unidentified. I like that. That's a fun title. It's like being an expert on anomalous phenomena.
a mile wide and fits the description of the CL-1201 pretty well. After all, they never did reveal what the second version of the plane was designed for. A Phoenix City Councilwoman launched an investigation into this event and said that of over the 700 witnesses she interviewed about the lights, the government never interviewed even one.
This one was pretty silly, but I do like the thought experiment and just the aspect of, what if we could make some really cool, crazy piece of engineering like this? And you don't really see that as much today, because it's all stuff from the 60s, but it could be that the stuff closer to today is yet to be declassified, and there's even crazier stuff out there, like maybe an even bigger one that is also a spacecraft and maybe has a cloaking device or something. Who knows? Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.